We never stopped. We had uncontrollable giggles. We couldn't stop. We couldn't look at each other.
Rock Hudson was the ultimate Hollywood heartthrob, but his most convincing performance never took place on the silver screen. That performance happened on November 9, 1955, inside a Lutheran chapel in Santa Barbara, California, when he married a woman named Phyllis Gates in front of a handful of witnesses and a team of studio photographers who were already waiting outside. This is the full story of how Universal Pictures engineered the most famous fake marriage in Hollywood history and what it cost the man trapped inside it for the rest of his life. The moment everything cracked, July 16, 1985, in Carmel, California. Doris Day stood in front of the cameras at a press conference promoting her new television show, smiling that famous smile, radiating the warmth the world expected from her. Standing beside her was a man who, 30 years earlier, had been voted the most handsome man in Hollywood. A man whose jawline and deep voice and effortless masculinity had defined what it meant to be an American leading man. On this particular afternoon, something was terribly, visibly wrong with Rock Hudson. His cheeks had gone hollow, and his speech came out slurred, and the clothes hung off a frame that once filled movie screens with an almost impossible physical perfection. Reporters in the room began murmuring to each other, and a question started rippling through the crowd and then outward through the entire country. A question nobody wanted to ask out loud. What happened to Rock Hudson? 9 days later, the world received its answer, and that answer changed everything. Not just for Hollywood, not just for the entertainment industry, but for the entire trajectory of a global health crisis that was, at that point, being willfully ignored by the most powerful government on Earth. But the secret revealed in July of 1985 that Rock Hudson was dying of AIDS was not the first secret this man had carried. It was not even the biggest one. The biggest secret had been engineered 3 decades earlier, when a Hollywood machine so ruthless and so calculating that it was willing to destroy the private life of its biggest star, decided to manufacture a marriage to protect the bottom line. The invention of Rock Hudson. Understanding why Rock Hudson's marriage was arranged requires understanding that Rock Hudson himself was arranged. Every piece of the man the public adored had been assembled, tested, and polished by other hands. Born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. on November 17, 1925, in Winnetka, Illinois, he came into the world as a quiet suburb kid whose father, a German and Swiss descent auto mechanic, abandoned the family during the Great Depression when Roy was just 4 years old. Catherine, his Irish descent mother, worked odd jobs to keep them afloat and eventually remarried a former Marine Corps officer named Wallace Fitzgerald, a man Roy reportedly despised, but whose surname he took anyway. Nothing about Roy Fitzgerald's childhood pointed toward movie stardom. At New Trier High School, the same school that later produced Charlton Heston and Anne Margaret, Roy auditioned for school plays and got turned away because he could not memorize his lines, a problem that dogged him well into his professional career. After graduating, he served in the Navy during World War II as an aircraft mechanic stationed in the Philippines. And when the war ended, he drifted out to Los Angeles with a dream, and nothing much else backing it up, taking a job as a truck driver while loitering outside studio gates and mailing his headshot to every producer whose address he could find. Nobody bit. Nobody called back. Nobody cared. And then in 1947, Roy Fitzgerald walked into the office of a man named Henry Willson, and his entire life split in two. Henry Willson was a talent agent, but calling him a talent agent misses the point entirely, like calling P.T. Barnum a circus owner. Willson operated as a manufacturer of men, raw, often untrained. Almost always spectacularly good-looking young men came into his office, and entirely different people walked out. Willson capped their teeth, retrained their walks, coached their voices, and sent them all to the same dentist, the same barber, the same clothing store. And then he stamped new names on them, names so aggressively masculine and so absurdly virile that they became punchlines even as they became famous. Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter, Troy Donahue, Guy Madison, Ty Hardin, Rory Calhoun, Race Gentry, Touch Connors. These were not names, they were brands, and Henry Willson ran the branding agency. The legend that has survived for decades goes like this. When Roy Fitzgerald walked into Wilson's office, the agent looked at this tall, impossibly handsome truck driver and asked one question. "Can you act?" Roy answered no, and Willson reportedly replied with relief because acting was beside the point. Willson saw raw material, not talent, and raw material was exactly what he specialized in. Combining the Rock of Gibraltar with the Hudson River, Willson invented the name Rock Hudson and then set about inventing the man to go with it. Acting classes, singing lessons, dancing instruction, fencing practice, horseback riding sessions, all of it fed into a charm school assembly line that Universal International financed after signing him in 1949, once Warner Brothers had let an initial contract lapse. And here is exactly how raw Roy Fitzgerald was when the cameras first rolled on him. In his 1948 debut, a war picture called Fighter Squadron, Rock Hudson had one single line of dialogue, and delivering it required 38 takes, 38 attempts to say the words, "You've got to get a bigger blackboard." But Henry Willson understood something instinctively that Universal understood too, and that the American public would eventually confirm with hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. Whether Rock Hudson could act barely mattered. What mattered was the feeling he created when he walked into a frame, the way women wanted to be with him and men wanted to be him. And so the machine ground forward. By 1954, Magnificent Obsession had grossed over $5 million. By 1955, filming on Giant alongside James Dean and Elizabeth Taylor was wrapping up. Life magazine put Rock Hudson on its cover and christened him Hollywood's Most Handsome Bachelor. Hollywood's Most Handsome Bachelor, that phrase was about to become the most dangerous collection of words in Rock Hudson's entire life. The confidential crisis. During the mid-1950s, one publication terrified Hollywood more than any critic, more than any rival studio, more than any congressional committee. That publication was a scandal magazine called Confidential. Robert Harrison founded Confidential in December of 1952, and by 1955 it had become the best-selling magazine in the United States, outselling Time, outselling Life, with circulation topping 4 million copies per issue. All of that success came from doing one thing extremely well, destroying famous people. The magazine's specialty was scandal, covering affairs, arrests, addictions, and most lucratively of all, sexual secrets. Harrison employed a network of private investigators, hotel clerks, prostitutes, bartenders, and disgruntled insiders to compile dossiers on Hollywood's biggest names, and the preferred method of operation worked like something that would not receive a formal name for decades but that we now call catch and kill. The operation ran like clockwork. Confidential's investigators assembled a story, gathered evidence including photographs, witness statements, and police reports, and then presented the finished product to the subject or the subject's studio with an implicit proposition. Either we publish this, or you give us something better, a different story, a different name, a bigger target. What it amounted to was an extortion operation dressed up as journalism. In 1955, Confidential pointed its machinery at the biggest target in Hollywood. The magazine's investigators had compiled evidence of Rock Hudson's homosexuality. 2 of his former lovers were approached and offered $10,000 each to tell their stories on the record, and both turned the money down. But Confidential had gathered enough from other sources to run a piece that, in the moral climate of 1955 America, would have ended his career overnight. What 1955 meant in practical terms cannot be overstated. The tail end of the McCarthy era was still casting its shadow. The Lavender Scare, which was the systematic purging of gay and lesbian people from government jobs, continued in full swing. Homosexuality was not just socially unacceptable, it was a criminal offense in many states. And every major studio contract contained what was called a morality clause, a provision allowing the studio to terminate any actor who, in the language of the time, forfeited the respect of the public. Universal had poured millions into Rock Hudson. He represented their #1 asset, their franchise, their golden goose. And Confidential magazine was about to cook that goose. That is when Henry Willson stepped in and did what Henry Willson always did. He made a deal. Robert Hoffler, who wrote the definitive biography of Willson titled The Man Who Invented Rock Hudson, calls it one of the dirtiest deals in Wilson's entire career, which is really saying something given the competition. Willson went to Confidential and proposed a trade, kill the Rock Hudson story, and I will hand you 2 stories that are almost as good. The first sacrifice was Rory Calhoun, another Willson client, a rugged Western star with a tough guy image. What the public never knew was that Calhoun, born Francis Durgan, had served time at San Quentin as a young man. Willson handed Confidential his client's prison record. When the story ran, it actually helped Calhoun's career because the reformed bad boy angle only made audiences like him more. The second sacrifice was Tab Hunter, yet another Willson client, a blonde heartthrob who had recently fired Willson as his agent. Arthur Galen, Hunter's real name, had been arrested at a gay party in Glendale, California in 1950. Confidential ran that story in its September 1955 issue. The timing was no coincidence. It was Wilson's payback against a client who had dared to walk away from him. Sit with that for a moment. To protect Rock Hudson, Henry Willson fed 2 of his own clients to the wolves. He traded their privacy, their dignity, and their safety to buy himself one thing: enough time to execute the only plan that could permanently silence the rumors swirling around his most valuable property. Rock Hudson needed a wife, and the clock was ticking. The orchestration of Phyllis Gates. The woman selected to become Mrs. Rock Hudson was named Phyllis Gates. Around 29 years old at the time, she had grown up on a 600-acre farm in Dawson, Minnesota, about as far from Hollywood as you can get, both geographically and culturally. After leaving home, she moved to New York, then on to Los Angeles, and by 1954 she had landed a job as Henry Willson's personal secretary. October of 1954 marked the first time she met Rock Hudson, when he came through Wilson's office door. By all accounts, the 2 of them got along, they socialized, they were friendly, and what happened after that depends entirely on whose version of events you choose to believe. This is where the story fractures in ways that historians and biographers are still arguing over today. Phyllis Gates told her own version in a 1987 memoir called My Husband, Rock Hudson. According to her, she was a young woman who fell genuinely in love with a movie star, had no idea about his sexuality, married in a whirlwind, and only discovered the truth when the relationship began falling apart around her. She painted herself as a victim, plain and simple. Robert Hoffler's version, built from exhaustive research and dozens of interviews with people who knew Gates personally, told a completely different story. Every single person Hoffler met who knew Phyllis Gates called her a lesbian. Hoffler reported that Gates told friends she was marrying Hudson because it would be fun. According to his sources, she understood the arrangement perfectly, viewing it as a marriage of mutual convenience where she would gain the lifestyle, the status, and the freedom to pursue her own relationships with women, while Hudson gained the protective cover of a wife. A third perspective came from Mark Griffin's 2018 biography, All That Heaven Allows, the most comprehensive book ever written about Rock Hudson. Griffin laid both accounts side by side and flagged something curious. Before the marriage, Gates and Hudson's ex-boyfriend Jack Navarre had been friends, had taken a road trip together, and had even visited a gay bar together. That is not typical behavior for a woman who supposedly had no clue about her future husband's private life. The truth probably sits somewhere between these competing narratives. Phyllis Gates held to her version until the day she died. What remains undisputed, what nobody argues about, is the sequence of events that followed. On November 9, 1955, Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates drove to Santa Barbara, picked up a speeding ticket on the way, and were married in a Lutheran ceremony with Pat Devlin, Jim Mattotoni, and his wife standing as witnesses. A reception followed at the Biltmore. On the marriage license, Hudson used his legal name, Roy Fitzgerald. And from the instant the ceremony ended, the Universal Pictures publicity machine kicked into overdrive. Studio photographers had been positioned at the wedding. Staged photographs captured the couple feeding each other cake. A honeymoon at the Half Moon Hotel in Jamaica came next. And naturally, more photographers were already waiting there. Pictures went out of the newlyweds drinking from coconuts and walking the beach, living out the dream of marital bliss for the cameras. Back in Hollywood, the couple visited Lauren Bacall on the set of Written on the Wind and entertained 25 Korean War orphans as part of a publicity push for Hudson's upcoming film Battle Hymn. Every major gossip columnist received exclusive access from Hedda Hopper to Luella Parsons. Every interview was scripted. Every photograph was composed. At one point during these staged appearances, Hudson reportedly raised a glass to his bride and said something that, knowing what we know now, carries a devastating double meaning. The gist of his words was this: we must always stick together and not let anyone try to pull us apart, because Hollywood is full of vicious people who spread rumors, and you must never believe any of them. Confidential backed off, the rumors quieted, and for a brief stretch the plan appeared to have worked flawlessly. But a performance is only as good as its ability to sustain itself, and this particular performance was already beginning to crack. A life of scripted isolation. The newlyweds moved into Hudson's cottage at 951 Warbler Place, perched high above the Sunset Strip in a neighborhood of winding roads named after birds. Biographers have since given that stretch of hillside a nickname that tells you everything about who lived there and why. They called it Beardland. A beard, in Hollywood slang, refers to a person, usually a woman, who serves as a romantic cover for a gay man. Up in the hills above the Sunset Strip during the mid to late 1950s, there were a lot of beards. Stephen Kijak, who directed the 2023 HBO documentary Rock Hudson, All That Heaven Allowed, noted that the couple really did get along at first, that they had chemistry and could make each other laugh. But he added that the arranged marriage situation did not go well for either of them as time wore on. The core problem was simple and had no solution. Rock Hudson was living a lie every hour of every day inside his own home, turning the one place that should have been a sanctuary into another movie set, another scene requiring him to hit his marks and play the role of devoted husband. Biographers describe his behavior growing increasingly distant during the marriage. The drinking increased, the late nights multiplied, the moodiness deepened, and according to some accounts, he had a same-sex encounter the very day after the wedding. Whether that specific claim holds up or not, what is unmistakable is that Hudson never stopped being who he was. The marriage functioned as a costume, not a cure, and costumes always come off eventually. For Phyllis, regardless of what she did or did not know walking in, the marriage created its own kind of trap. If she truly married for love, then she spent those years watching her husband drift away for reasons she could not understand, living in a town where everyone else seemed to share a secret she had been excluded from. And if she entered the arrangement knowingly, then a different prison formed around her, one where she was bound to a bargain she could never publicly acknowledge and unable to demand the emotional connection that even a transactional marriage needs in order to function. Neither version ends happily. The Warbler Place cottage was not a home, it was a stage, and by the beginning of 1958, the curtain was about to come crashing down on both of them. The secret recording, January of 1958, brought something extraordinary, something that would stay buried for decades and only reach full public light through the work of Josh Young and Manfred Westphal, whose 2024 book, The Fixer, drew on the personal archives of one of Hollywood's most notorious operators. That operator was Fred Otash, and calling him a private detective sells the man dramatically short. The same way calling Confidential a magazine misses what it actually was. Otash bugged hotel rooms, tapped phones, followed people through the streets, and compiled dirt on anyone worth compiling dirt on. For years, he had freelanced as an investigator for Confidential, and now Phyllis Gates had put him on her payroll. What Otash did next went beyond investigation. He scripted an entire confrontation, writing out specific, pointed, psychologically loaded questions for Phyllis to ask her husband, and then he recorded the whole thing. The resulting transcript, which surfaced through the Hollywood Reporter in 2013 and received fuller exploration in The Fixer, stands as one of the most extraordinary primary documents in Hollywood history. Raw, uncomfortable, and devastating from the first exchange to the last. Gates, reading from Otash's prepared script, confronted Hudson with references to his own dream analysis. She told him he had described seeing thousands of butterflies and also snakes, that butterflies meant femininity and snakes represented the male penis. She pressed him about the speed of their intimate encounters, asking whether he was that fast with boys too. Hudson's response functioned as both evasion and accidental confession at the same time. His words were, "Boys don't fit, so this is why it lasts longer." When Gates escalated the confrontation and accused him directly, saying everyone knew he had been picking up boys off the street shortly after the wedding and had continued doing so under the assumption that being married would cover for him, Hudson denied it. But the denial came wrapped in a sentence that collapsed under its own weight. He told her he had never picked up any boys other than to give them a ride. That transcript, recorded without Hudson's knowledge, preserved in Otash's files and hidden for over half a century, became Phyllis Gates's leverage, and she deployed it without hesitation. Divorce proceedings opened in April of 1958. Gates filed on grounds of mental cruelty, a standard California legal formula of the era. Hudson's initial offer amounted to almost nothing, what Gates's side later characterized as a few measly bucks. But once her attorney Arthur Crowley brought Otash into the picture and made clear exactly what evidence they held, Hudson's resistance evaporated. The final settlement told the whole story. Gates walked away with the Warbler Place house, valued at $32,000 at the time, along with a car, $250 per week for 10 years, which adds up to roughly $1.3 million in today's money, and stock in Hudson's production company, Seven Pictures Corporation. 3 years. That is how long the marriage lasted from ceremony to settlement. Phyllis Gates never remarried, became an interior decorator, lived quietly, and died of lung cancer on January 4, 2006, still maintaining to anyone who would listen that she had been an innocent wife who married for love. The years in hiding. After the divorce, Universal's publicity department did what it had always done and simply rewrote the narrative. Rock Hudson was repackaged as the tragic, lonely bachelor, the handsome star who just could not find the right girl, the man who had loved and lost and now devoted himself entirely to his craft. None of it was true. Behind the carefully managed public image, Rock Hudson was living the life he had always wanted to live, but only in secret, only behind closed doors, only among people he trusted absolutely. His home above Beverly Hills, the place friends simply called the Castle, became the center of a tight-knit, fiercely protective gay social circle. One friend from that era recalled, "We didn't go out to restaurants, we went to Rock's house. Because at Rock's house you could relax, you could stop performing, you could be yourself." And through those hidden years, Rock Hudson moved through a series of serious romantic relationships that the public knew nothing about. Jack Navarre was an actor Hudson had lived with, starting in May of 1953, before the marriage to Gates. The two of them developed a private code, a tap pattern against a surface, 1, 2, 3, that meant "I love you." 3 simple taps communicating what Rock Hudson could never say out loud in public. Lee Garlington entered the picture next, a stockbroker and former extra who dated Hudson from 1962 to 1965. In the posthumous biography Hudson authorized before his death, he called Garlington his true love. Garlington himself spoke to People magazine in 2015 and described their relationship with a detail that manages to be both tender and heartbreaking at the same time. His words were, "We couldn't take any pictures together. It was too dangerous. We could only take pictures of each other." Consider what that means. The most photographed man in Hollywood, a man whose face had appeared on the cover of every major magazine in the world, could not take a single photograph with the person he loved. Their only joint picture was snapped in a New Orleans bar where nobody recognized either of them. They vacationed together in Puerto Vallarta on Elizabeth Taylor's recommendation, because Taylor, who had co-starred with Hudson in Giant and would remain his friend for life, was one of the few people who knew the full truth and accepted it without conditions. Tom Clark, an MGM and Disney publicist, lived with Hudson for roughly 17 years, making it the longest relationship of Hudson's entire life. Clark was protective, loyal, and deeply devoted. In 1990, 5 years after Hudson's death, Clark published a memoir called Rock Hudson, Friend of Mine, and the title alone reveals something about the era they both lived through. Even half a decade after losing the man he had shared his life with for nearly 2 decades, Tom Clark could not publicly call himself what he was. And then, there was the Jim Nabors disaster. During the early 1970s, a gay couple in Huntington Beach sent out annual joke party invitations. One year, the invitation read, "You are cordially invited to the wedding reception of Rock Hudson and Jim Nabors." The punchline was that Hudson would take Nabors' famous character's surname and become Rock Pile. A fan magazine picked up the story. A Chicago radio DJ amplified it. The rumor metastasized internationally. Both men were deeply closeted, and both were terrified. And despite the fact that the whole thing started as a harmless prank by people who had no connection to either of them, the damage proved irreversible. Rock Hudson and Jim Nabors never spoke to each other again after the rumor broke. A friendship destroyed by a joke that was never even about them. Nabors finally married his partner of 38 years, Stan Cadwallader, in 2013 at the age of 82, by which point Hudson had already been dead for 28 years. One more detail from these hidden decades deserves mention. Rock Hudson was a conservative Republican who campaigned for Barry Goldwater alongside Ronald Reagan in 1964 and voted Republican his entire life. John Wayne, who co-starred with Hudson in The Undefeated, reportedly put it this way, "Who cares if he's queer? The man plays a great game of chess." And it was the Republican administration of his old acquaintance Ronald Reagan that would, in the final months of Hudson's life, decline to help him when he needed it most. The diagnosis. June 5, 1984 marked the day everything changed inside Rock Hudson's body, even if the outside world would not learn about it for another year. He went to see a doctor about a red mark on his neck that Nancy Reagan herself had noticed 3 weeks earlier at a White House state dinner honoring the President of Mexico. She had urged him to get it checked. The biopsy came back as Kaposi's sarcoma. The blood test came back positive for HIV. Rock Hudson had AIDS at 58 years old, and he told almost no one. 2 close friends received the news, Mark Miller, his secretary, and George Nader, an actor who had been part of Hudson's inner circle for decades. But Mark Christian, the young man sharing his home as his live-in partner at the time, was told nothing. December of 1984 brought a new role, a recurring character named Daniel Reese on Dynasty, which at that point ranked as the biggest show on television. One particular scene sent Hudson into private agony, a scripted kiss with Linda Evans after her character falls from a horse. Before filming the scene, Hudson gargled with mouthwash and used disinfectant sprays, agonizing over the possibility that he might transmit the virus through a kiss. A fear that was medically unfounded but felt absolutely real to a man who was terrified and had nobody qualified to tell him otherwise. After the cameras stopped rolling, Hudson told Mark Miller, "The kiss is over with, thank God." Filming continued through April of 1985. And behind the scenes, Hudson did something that reveals a conscience wrestling with circumstances that had no clean answers. He arranged for an associate to send anonymous letters to his former sexual partners. The letters read, "Hi, this note shall remain anonymous for obvious reasons, since we have had intimate sexual contact where sperm has passed between us. I feel it is only fair that I tell you that I have found out I have AIDS." Anonymous. Even in the act of warning men he might have exposed, Rock Hudson could not use his own name. The closet that Henry Willson constructed for him back in 1955 still held its door firmly shut, even as the man inside was dying. The unraveling, and then came July 16, 1985, and the Doris Day press conference that opened this story. Doris Day and Rock Hudson had been one of the most beloved on-screen pairings in movie history. The couple behind Pillow Talk, Lover Come Back, and Send Me No Flowers. They represented wholesome, funny, impossibly attractive America. Day had not known about Hudson's sexuality until very late in their friendship, and when she finally learned the truth, she did what Doris Day always did. She did not flinch. At the Carmel press conference, Day saw what every reporter in the room saw, that her old friend looked shockingly, visibly ill. And she responded with an act that, in the context of 1985 America and the mass hysteria surrounding AIDS, required extraordinary courage. She embraced him, she kissed him, on camera, in front of the entire world. 2 days later, Hudson flew to Paris to receive an experimental drug called HPA-23 at the Pasteur Institute. On July 21st, he collapsed at the Ritz Hotel. Dale Olson, his American publicist, initially told the press the illness was inoperable liver cancer, but the truth was pushing through. On July 24th, Hudson's team sent a telegram to the White House requesting Nancy Reagan's help in arranging his transfer from the Ritz to a French military hospital called Percy, which had better treatment facilities. Rock Hudson had attended state dinners at the White House. He had campaigned for Reagan. In the language of Hollywood and Washington, he qualified as a friend. What happened next has been documented through records obtained from the Reagan Presidential Library by the Mattachine Society, later published by BuzzFeed News in 2015. Mark Weinberg, Nancy Reagan's aide, recommended she decline the request. His stated reasoning was about treating everybody the same, arguing it would be unfair to use political influence for one patient when others lacked that option. Nancy agreed. The request was denied. You can read that decision charitably as a question of fairness and protocol, or you can weigh it against the broader context, an administration that had refused to address the AIDS epidemic, a president who in July of 1985 had never once publicly uttered the word AIDS, a political culture treating the disease as a moral judgment rather than a medical crisis. Either way, the documented facts are the documented facts. Ronald Reagan did personally call Rock Hudson that day, and they spoke briefly. The following day, July 25, 1985, Hudson's French publicist Yannou Collart issued the statement that shattered everything open. Rock Hudson has AIDS. No major public figure anywhere in the world had ever made that announcement before, and the impact landed immediately, hitting like a seismic wave that could not be reversed. The final act, French Defense Minister Charles Hernu eventually intervened to get Hudson admitted to the Percy Military Hospital, but his doctor there, Dominique Dormont, determined that treatment was futile because the disease had advanced too far. Hudson needed to get home, but no commercial airline would take him because the fear of AIDS in 1985 ran so deep and so irrational that carriers refused to allow a dying man on board their planes. A chartered Air France 747 costing approximately $250,000 flew him from Paris to Los Angeles. From the airport, he was helicoptered to UCLA Medical Center, and by late August, he had been released to home hospice at the castle. Tom Clark came back. He had largely been displaced by Mark Christian in Hudson's life, but he came back, because that is what love does, even when it has no name, even when it exists in the margins, in the spaces between what is said and what is meant. September of 1985 brought the Commitment to Life benefit, organized by Elizabeth Taylor, one of the first major AIDS fundraisers, held at the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles. Hudson was too ill to attend in person, but he dictated a statement that Burt Lancaster read on his behalf to the crowd. The words were simple, honest, and as close as Rock Hudson ever came to speaking publicly about what his life had actually been. His message: "I am not happy that I am sick. I am not happy that I have AIDS. But if that is helping others, I can at least know that my own misfortune has had some positive worth." During his final week, Rock Hudson, who had lived as an atheist his entire life, made a confession to a Catholic priest that Tom Clark had summoned. Shirley Boone and Pat Boone visited. Whether he found peace in those last days, nobody can say with certainty. On October 2, 1985, at approximately 8:30 in the morning, Tom Clark went downstairs to refill his coffee. The nurse buzzed him back up, her words: "We've lost him." Rock Hudson was 59 years old. His estate totaled roughly $27 million, left primarily to his secretary Mark Miller. A separate bequest of $250,000 went to help seed AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, co-founded by Elizabeth Taylor and Dr. Michael Gottlieb. Hudson's ashes were scattered at sea between Wilmington and Catalina Island, with a marker standing at Forest Lawn in Cathedral City, though his remains belong to the Pacific. The aftermath and the reckoning. What followed Rock Hudson's death cannot be measured in column inches or evening news segments alone. Within days of October 2nd, Congress allocated $221 million for AIDS research, more than doubling the previous year's commitment in a single vote. Private donations to AIDS charities more than doubled year over year, and Ronald Reagan, who had never publicly spoken the word AIDS until September 17, 1985, barely 2 weeks before Hudson died, suddenly found the word in his vocabulary. Randy Shilts, the journalist who covered the epidemic for the San Francisco Chronicle and later wrote the landmark book And the Band Played On, put it in terms that have become the accepted historical verdict. There were two clear phases of the disease in the United States: AIDS before Rock Hudson and AIDS after. Morgan Fairchild said Rock Hudson's death gave AIDS a face. Joan Rivers recalled that 2 years earlier, when she hosted a benefit for AIDS, she could not get a single major star to attend, and that Hudson's admission was a horrendous way to bring the disease to public attention, but that by doing so, he helped millions. And then came the lawsuit. Mark Christian, Hudson's final live-in partner, the man who was never told about the diagnosis, sued the estate for intentional infliction of emotional distress. A jury awarded $21.75 million, later reduced on appeal to $5.5 million. That case became a legal landmark, one of the first major rulings to address knowing non-disclosure of HIV status. Christian repeatedly tested negative for the virus. He lived until 2009. Tom Clark published his memoir, Phyllis Gates published hers, Robert Hoffler published his, Mark Griffin published his, and the debate still continues to this day. Who was Phyllis Gates really? What did she know? And when? Was the marriage a prison for one person or for two? The price of the performance. Roy Harold Scherer Jr. received a new name, a new face, a new walk, a new voice, and an entirely new life from a predatory agent who viewed him as a product to be sold. Universal put him under contract as a financial asset to be protected. Henry Willson married him off to a woman, whether willing or unwilling, knowing or unknowing, to satisfy a conservative public in a cynical industry. The result was the #1 box office star in America, an Academy Award nominee, a man whose films remain beloved decades later. And all of that was accomplished while carrying a secret that, if exposed, would have destroyed everything the machine had built. The morality clause in his Universal contract gave the studio the legal right to end his career the moment he forfeited the respect of the public. And in 1955, being gay would have triggered that clause. Not because anything was wrong with being gay, but because the studio system, the legal system, and the social system all agreed to pretend there was. Rock Hudson performed, not just on screen, but every single day of his life. Heterosexuality was performed. Masculinity was performed. The role of America's leading man was performed, not only in the movies but in his marriage, at dinner parties, in interviews, in public appearances, in every interaction with anyone outside his innermost circle. And the cost of that performance was everything. A photograph with the person he loved was forbidden. Saying "I love you" out loud was impossible, reduced to a coded tap of 1, 2, 3 against a wall. Holding hands, introducing a partner, grieving publicly when a relationship ended, celebrating when one began. None of it was permitted. Adored by millions, Rock Hudson was known by almost no one. You might be tempted to make this a simple morality tale. The evil studio, the predatory agent, the innocent star, and pieces of that framework absolutely hold true. Henry Willson was predatory. The studio system was ruthless. The morals clause served as an instrument of control. But the full picture resists simplification. Hudson was not purely a passive victim. He participated in his own deception because the alternative meant losing everything. And in 1955, in 1965, in 1975, losing everything was not a figure of speech. William Haynes, the silent film star who refused MGM's demand to enter a sham marriage in 1933, was effectively blacklisted from the industry. Haynes survived brilliantly as an interior designer, but his acting career ended the day he said no. Rock Hudson looked at that precedent and made a different choice. Was it the right choice? That question does not belong to any of us. It was the choice available to him inside the world he inhabited, under the pressures bearing down on him. Judging from the comfort of 2026, when marriage equality is the law and openly gay actors win Academy Awards, comes easy. Judging from inside 1955 would have been a different matter entirely. Judging from inside 1985 would not have been much better. What the record shows is this: Rock Hudson's life and Rock Hudson's death changed things. Not enough, not fast enough, but measurably, concretely, historically. $221 million flowed into AIDS research. A president spoke the name of the disease for the first time. An entire country confronted the fact that this epidemic was not happening to other people. It was happening to the man they had invited into their living rooms for 30 years. The man who made them laugh. The man who made them cry. The man they thought they knew. The most convincing performance of Rock Hudson's life was not magnificent obsession. It was not giant. It was not pillow talk. The most convincing performance was being someone he was not every single day for 40 years. And the greatest tragedy is not that the performance failed, the tragedy is that it succeeded. It succeeded so completely that when the truth finally surfaced, when the mask finally dropped, when the world finally glimpsed Roy Harold Scherer Jr. instead of Rock Hudson, it was too late to do anything but mourn. 59 years old, ashes scattered in the Pacific, and the machine that built him, the machine that used him, the machine that demanded he sacrifice his identity for their profit, that machine kept right on running. But something had shifted, something had cracked open, and through that crack, a little bit of truth got in. Not enough, never enough, but a start. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because next time we are going to explore the full story of Rock Hudson's final year, the diagnosis, the dynasty kiss, the desperate flight to Paris, and the anonymous letter that changed how America understood AIDS. That story deserves its own telling, and we are going to give it one. Until then, remember Rock Hudson, not the image, the man.